Hello, and welcome back to Historical Hues, your quiet corner for unwinding with the past. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me. Here, we let the gentle murmurs of history quiet the noise of the modern world, one story at a time. It's a space for curiosity and calm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love to see where you're listening from, so feel free to leave a comment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's imagine a room. The air is cool, carrying the scent of old parchment, dried herbs, and beeswax. Outside, a gentle, persistent rain is falling, tapping a soft, rhythmic beat against the leaded glass of a small window. This room is a physician's study, sometime in the high Middle Ages. Inside, the world isn't understood through microscopes or chemical analysis, but through a grand, elegant, and profoundly influential system of thought, humoral theory. To understand the medieval woman and how her body and mind were perceived, we must first settle into this room and understand this foundational belief. It is the very bedrock of 1,000 years of medicine, a cold, wet, and flawed foundation upon which everything else is built. At its heart, the theory was beautifully simple. The human body, the microcosm, was believed to be a reflection of the universe, the macrocosm. Just as the world was composed of 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, the body was composed of 4 corresponding fluids, or humors. Health was not the absence of disease, but the presence of a perfect delicate balance between these 4 substances. Sickness, in all its forms, was simply a state of imbalance. Too much of one humor, not enough of another. The entire practice of medicine was dedicated to identifying which humor was out of alignment and gently coaxing the body back into its natural, harmonious rhythm. The first of these humors was blood, associated with the element of air. It was considered hot and wet. A person with a healthy abundance of blood was said to be sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, and sociable. Think of the warmth and dampness of a perfect spring day, full of life and vigor. This was the most desirable of the humors, the very essence of vitality. Next came phlegm, linked to the element of water. As you might guess, its qualities were cold and wet. A person in whom phlegm was dominant was phlegmatic, calm, stoic, and perhaps a little sluggish. Their temperament mirrored the quiet, cold dampness of winter. While not as celebrated as blood, a certain amount of phlegm was necessary for a stable constitution. Then there was yellow bile, or choler, which corresponded to the element of fire. Its nature was hot and dry. A choleric individual was fiery, ambitious, and quick to anger, their personality burning with the intensity of a dry summer heat, a necessary force for action and drive, but one that could easily flare out of control. It's easy to imagine a medieval lord excusing a fit of temper by complaining that his choler was acting up that day. Finally, there was black bile, known as melancholy, linked to the earth. It was cold and dry. This humor was associated with autumn, a season of decay and introspection. A melancholic person was thoughtful, sensitive, and prone to sadness. This was the humor of poets, scholars, and hermits, a disposition that could lead to profound thought or debilitating despair. This elegant system, first proposed by the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates, and later codified into an unshakable doctrine by the Roman physician Galen, became the absolute authority in European medicine for over 500 years. This is a mainstream historical fact that cannot be overstated. Galen's writings were treated with the same reverence as Scripture. To question them was to question the very order of the cosmos. And central to this ordered cosmos was a clear hierarchy. The qualities of hot and dry were considered active, generative, and perfect. The qualities of cold and wet were passive, receptive, and incomplete. From this simple premise flowed the entire medieval understanding of gender. The male form was considered the pinnacle of creation because it was fundamentally hot and dry. This internal heat, this biological furnace, was what cooked a man to perfection. It gave him his strength, his reason, his drive, and his physical completeness. The female form, by contrast, was defined by being cold and wet. This wasn't necessarily seen as a malicious curse, but as a simple, observable fact of nature. A woman was, in essence, an imperfectly cooked man. Her body lacked the vital heat to complete the developmental process. Her constitution, like the damp earth of a winter field, was passive and receptive, not active and generative. This coldness made her inherently weaker, and the wetness made her constitutionally unstable, prone to leakage and emotional floods. Her very nature was seen as less stable, more porous. It's a bit like comparing a well-fired piece of pottery to one that was taken from the kiln too soon. One is strong and holds its shape. The other, in their view, was perpetually soft and vulnerable. It sounds less like a medical diagnosis and more like a complaint about a leaky roof. This belief system colored every aspect of a woman's life. Her perceived emotional volatility wasn't a personality trait, but a symptom of her wet constitution. Her physical stamina, her intellectual capacity, her role in society, all were explained and justified through this lens of humoral imbalance. A quirky tidbit from this era is how deeply this belief permeated daily life, especially diet. If you were feeling melancholic, too cold and dry, you might be prescribed a hot and wet meal, like chicken simmered in a broth with moistening herbs. A choleric fever might be treated with cold and wet, foods like cucumber or melon. Trying to maintain your humoral balance sounds far more complicated than any modern wellness trend. Historians still argue whether the common layperson, the farmer or the baker's wife, meticulously tracked their humoral state, or if this was a preoccupation of the wealthy and the educated. It's more likely that a simplified version trickled down into folk wisdom. A general understanding of hot and cold diseases and remedies passed through generations. But for the physicians and scholars who wrote the texts and advised the nobility, this was not folk wisdom. It was science. It was the unshakable truth that explained why the world and the people in it were the way they were. This cold, wet, and flawed foundation. The idea that woman was a constitutionally inferior version of man is the critical starting point for our entire journey. It is the quiet, ever-present assumption that will inform every diagnosis, every prescription, and every piece of advice given to women for centuries to come. Let us now turn our minds to one of the most peculiar and persistent ideas in the long history of medicine, a concept that feels almost like a fable, yet was treated with the utmost seriousness for well over 2 millennia. This is the curious case of the wandering womb, the very name of the ailment it was said to cause. Hysteria is a direct echo of this ancient belief, stemming from the Greek word hystera, which simply means uterus. This was not a metaphor, not a turn of phrase, but a literal diagnosis. To the physicians of antiquity, and later to their medieval successors who inherited their texts and theories, the womb was a distinct entity, almost an animal living within a woman's body. It was believed to be a restless creature, prone to dissatisfaction, but under certain conditions, capable of detaching from its moorings in the lower abdomen and embarking on a journey throughout the body. Imagine for a moment the worldview required to accept this. In a time before detailed anatomical knowledge, before the inner workings of the body were mapped and understood, It was a landscape of mystery. The body was a vessel of humors and spirits, a place where organs could possess a certain will of their own. The womb, in this framework, was seen as particularly volatile. It was thought to crave moisture and, most importantly, the act of procreation. If a woman remained a widow for too long, or was unmarried and celibate, her uterus would become dry, light, and unhappy with its station. It was, in their view, like an unwatered plant, pulling up its roots in search of a more hospitable environment. It would begin to wander. The path of this wandering organ was believed to be the direct cause of its terrifying symptoms. If the womb traveled upwards, it could press against the diaphragm and liver, causing shortness of breath and a crushing weight in the chest. If it continued its ascent, it might lodge itself in the throat, creating a terrifying sensation of suffocation, a feeling of a lump or a ball that could not be dislodged. This specific symptom was so common, it had its own name, globus hystericus. Should the womb press against the heart, it was said to induce palpitations, fainting spells, and overwhelming anxiety. If it reached the head, the physicians reasoned, it could interfere with the very seat of reason, causing seizures, temporary blindness, loss of speech, and what we would now call severe emotional distress. The diagnosis was a chilling one, suggesting a rogue element within one's own body, an internal traitor causing chaos without warning. It was an explanation that, while incorrect, provided a framework for a collection of very real and frightening symptoms that were otherwise inexplicable. So, how did a medieval physician propose to deal with this wayward organ? The logic of the cure was as strange as the perceived disease, yet it followed a certain intuitive, if flawed, reasoning. If the womb was like a roving animal, then it could be coaxed and herded like one. The primary tools for this task were smells. The womb, it was believed, was naturally drawn to pleasant, fragrant aromas and was violently repelled by foul, noxious odors. The treatment, therefore, was a two-pronged aromatic assault designed to guide the organ back to its rightful place. First, the physician would attempt to lure the womb downwards. The patient would be instructed to sit over a brazier of sweet-smelling substances. You can almost picture the scene: a room, thick with the heavy, sweet smoke of burning incense, perhaps frankincense or myrrh. The physician, with a grave expression, might prepare a concoction of pleasant herbs and spices: cinnamon, lavender, and crushed rose petals to be heated in water, allowing the fragrant steam to rise. Perfumes and scented oils would be applied directly to the patient's thighs and lower abdomen, an aromatic invitation for the wandering womb to come home. It was a form of aromatherapy, though perhaps not for the patient's peace of mind, but for the supposed navigational needs of her uterus. It's a bit like trying to coax a cat out from under a bed with a tasty treat. Only the treat was a cloud of expensive perfume, and the cat was a major internal organ. Simultaneously, the second part of the treatment would begin: to chase the womb away from the upper body, where it was causing the most dangerous symptoms. The patient would be subjected to powerfully awful smells. The physician would hold foul-smelling things directly under her nose. This wasn't a matter of simply waving a rotten piece of fruit. The materia medica of the time had a full arsenal of offensive options. They might burn a feather, filling the air with that uniquely acrid scent. Or perhaps they would use wool, horn, or even leather, creating a pungent, choking smoke. One particularly popular and rather quirky remedy involved castoreum, a secretion from the glands of a beaver, which has a strong, musky, and not entirely pleasant odor. Pitch and asphalt might be melted to release their sharp, chemical fumes. The patient was thus trapped in a sensory pincer movement, a fragrant paradise below, and a festival of foulness above. Historians still argue whether physicians truly believed in the literal mechanics of this process, or if the ritual was more symbolic, a powerful act of medical theater meant to reassure a distressed patient. Yet, the texts they left behind described the process with such clinical detail that it seems they held a genuine belief in its efficacy. For the woman enduring this treatment, it must have been an overwhelming experience. Imagine the desperate hope that this strange ritual would work, that the feeling of suffocation would subside, all while enduring a barrage of scents that ranged from the divine to the disgusting. This deep-seated belief in the wandering womb persisted for centuries, a testament to the power of an idea to shape the perception of health and illness, and a constant struggle for those whose bodies were seen not as a complex biological system, but as a home for a very, very picky traveler. La partie. Let us now drift back in time, further back than the stone hearths of the last section, to the sun-drenched marble and intellectual hum of ancient Athens. Imagine a quiet grove, the Lyceum, where the air is thick with the scent of olive trees and the gentle, dry dust of a Greek afternoon. Here, amidst the shade, a man of immense intellect paces, his thoughts shaping not just philosophy, but biology, politics, and the very understanding of humanity for centuries to come. This man is Aristotle, a figure whose shadow stretches long across the Western world. He was a student of Plato and, in a well-known turn of history, the personal tutor to a young Alexander the Great, filling the future conqueror's mind with logic and a profound curiosity about the natural world. Aristotle was a meticulous observer. He spent countless hours dissecting animals, peering into the intricate structures of cuttlefish, examining the developing embryos in chicken eggs, and documenting the world around him with a rigor that was revolutionary for his time. He was, in many ways, the father of biology. Yet, his observations were filtered through the philosophical lens of his era, a lens that sought order, purpose, and hierarchy in all things. And it was through this lens that he formulated one of history's most influential and enduringly damaging ideas about women, the theory of the female as a misbegotten male. To understand this, you must first understand his concept of vital heat. For Aristotle, heat was not simply a measure of temperature. It was the active and creative principle of the universe. It was the force that cooked, shaped, and perfected matter. A strong fire in a forge could turn rough iron ore into a sharp, well-formed sword. A gentle warmth in the soil could coax a seed into a towering tree. This vital heat, he believed, was the essence of life and perfection, and it was primarily associated with male. The male body was hotter, more active, and therefore possessed more of this generative, form-giving power. The female body, by contrast, was considered cooler, more passive, and composed of matter waiting to be shaped. Now, picture how Aristotle applied this to the mystery of conception. In his view, procreation was a kind of cosmic craft. The father's seed did not just contribute genetic material, as we understand it today. It contributed the form and the soul of the child. It was the blueprint and the builder, all in one. Most importantly, it carried the crucial ingredient that vital heat. The mother, on the other hand, contributed the raw material, the menses, which he saw as a kind of unrefined, nutritive substance. She provided the clay, but the father was the sculptor. The creation of a new life was, in his mind, a battle of heat. When a man and a woman came together, his seed, full of fiery potential, went to work on her passive matter. If the father was in his prime, full of vigor, and his vital heat was potent and sufficient, it would thoroughly cook the material. It would master the substance completely, imposing its perfect form upon it. The result of this successful, high-temperature biological process was a male child, the pinnacle of human creation, a perfect specimen. But what if the father's vital heat was lacking? Perhaps he was too young or too old. Maybe he was tired or ill, or in a detail that sounds almost comical to our modern ears. Perhaps the wind was blowing from the south. Aristotle, like many ancient thinkers, believed a damp southerly wind could diminish a man's inner fire. It's a bit like blaming the weather for not getting the Wi-Fi signal you were hoping for. In any of these cases, if the father's seed lacked the requisite thermal power, it could not fully conquer and shape the female matter. The cooking process would be incomplete. The form would be imperfectly realized. The result was a female child. A woman, in this framework, was not a distinct and complete being in her own right, but an arrest in development. She was, quite literally, a misbegotten male, an imperfect version of what nature had intended to create. This idea is staggering in its implications. It wasn't born of simple malice, but from a deep-seated philosophical need to see the world as a ladder of perfection, with humanity at its peak, and the male human at the very top of that peak. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's views on women were a reflection of common Athenian thought, or if he was a primary architect of a more codified form of misogyny. What is undeniable is that because his work became the foundation of Western science and medicine for nearly 2,000 years, this theory was not just a passing thought. It was taught in universities. It was cited by physicians. It was absorbed by theologians. It provided a seemingly rational, biological justification for treating women as inherently defective. They were seen as constitutionally colder, wetter, and weaker, lacking not just in physical strength, but in the very heat required for full rationality and moral fortitude. This wasn't merely a social prejudice. It was, for a very long time, considered a scientific fact. It's a powerful reminder of how even the most brilliant minds are products of their time, and how easily observation can be bent to fit a pre-existing belief. It is a strange and slightly sad tidbit of intellectual history that the same man who meticulously cataloged hundreds of species and even correctly identified that dolphins were mammals, not fish, also believed that eels spontaneously generated from mud when it was warmed by the sun, a testament to his fixation on heat as the ultimate creative force. The rhythm of their lives and the roles they were assigned were all underpinned by this fundamental philosophical assumption of a woman's cold, incomplete nature, a constant struggle against an innate imperfection assigned at the moment of conception. The very architecture of a medieval woman's life was built upon the rhythms of her body. But this connection was not always a celebrated one. While her fertility was prized, the monthly cycle that promised it was viewed with a profound and pervasive suspicion. It was a paradox that lived within her, a force of both life and perceived corruption. For the medieval mind, so steeped in theology, there was a simple, damning explanation for this duality. Menstruation was seen as a direct inheritance from Eve, a physical manifestation of her original sin. It was a monthly penance, a bleeding reminder that a woman's body was the vessel through which disobedience first entered the world. This wasn't merely a biological process. It was a recurring stain, a mark of inherent female weakness and impurity that set her apart, not just from men, but from the sacred. This belief was not just an abstract theological concept. It permeated every aspect of daily life, seeding a deep-seated fear of menstrual blood itself. It was widely considered to be a potent poison, a corrupt substance with the power to wreak havoc on the natural world. Imagine a farmer walking through his fields, his heart sinking as he notices a patch of once healthy grain inexplicably wilted and brown. He might not blame blight or poor soil. He might whisper that a woman in her monthly flux had merely walked past. Consider a vintner, carefully tending his barrels, who opens a cask to find the wine has soured, its rich bouquet turned to vinegar. It was a convenient excuse, perhaps, for a bad batch of fermentation. But the belief was sincere. The mere presence of a menstruating woman could curdle the wine. The most famous and detailed catalog of these fears comes from the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose writings were enormously influential throughout the Middle Ages. This serves as our mainstream historical fact. For the evening, Pliny claimed that contact with a menstruating woman could blunt the sharpest steel, tarnish polished ivory, cause fruit to fall from trees, and even kill a swarm of bees. He wrote, with complete conviction, that if a dog were to taste the blood, it would be driven into a state of incurable madness. One wonders if any medieval blacksmith ever tried to blame a dull sword on his wife's cycle instead of his own shoddy workmanship. These were not just old wives' tales. They were accepted as natural law, a grim testament to the dangerous power contained within the female form. The practical consequence of this perceived toxicity was a life of ritual impurity and forced separation. When a woman began her cycle, she entered a liminal state, becoming temporarily untouchable. She was often barred from the very heart of the community, the church. She could not approach the altar, receive communion, or sometimes even step across the threshold, for fear that her uncleanliness would desecrate the sacred space. Her touch was thought to taint food, so she might be forbidden from baking bread, churning butter, or salting meat, lest the whole household supply be spoiled. This separation could be stark. In some communities, women were required to withdraw to designated menstrual huts, small structures on the edge of the village, or were confined to a specific room in the house. Imagine the quiet of such a place. The air might be thick with the scent of damp earth and the low smoke of a small fire. The sounds would be muted, the rustle of straw bedding, the distant call of a bird, the soft murmur of other women sharing the same enforced exile. Historians still argue whether these periods of seclusion were universally experienced as a form of punishment, or if, for some women, they offered a welcome, if temporary, reprieve. It was a break from the unceasing demands of domestic labor, a time free from their husband's attentions, and an opportunity for a unique kind of female solidarity, a space where knowledge and stories could be shared away from the ears of men. Yet, the foundation of this seclusion was undeniably one of fear and control. And yet this substance, so feared, held a strange duality in folk belief. This brings us to a lesser-known tidbit, despite its poisonous reputation. Some folk traditions held that menstrual blood could be a powerful ingredient in protective amulets or even love charms. A drop, secretly added to a man's food or drink, was thought to bind his affection forever. It was a risky gambit, a sort of homeopathic magic where the poison became the cure, highlighting the complex and contradictory power attributed to women. A strange logic, to be sure, that the very thing that could supposedly drive a dog mad could also secure a happy home. Perhaps the dogs were just annoyed they weren't the ones getting the enchanted snacks. The shadow of these beliefs is long. The quiet shame, the euphemisms, the curse. Her flowers, visitor. They are all soft echoes of a time when this natural cycle was framed as a divine punishment. The modern inconvenience of hiding a tampon up one's sleeve is a distant descendant of the ancient necessity of hiding one's entire self away for days at a time. This constant struggle to reconcile the life-giving potential of the female body with the deep-seated cultural fear of its processes was a core part of the medieval woman's experience. Her body was a map of contradictions, a source of both errors and heresy, of life and perceived poison. It was a rhythm she lived by, a penance she paid, and a power she wielded, often in ways that the men who made the rules could never fully comprehend. The world saw a vessel of corruption. She simply saw the turning of her own personal moon. Let us now turn our minds from the broad, sweeping landscapes of kingdoms and conflicts and zoom in, closer, to the most intimate and fundamental mystery of all the creation of a human life. In the quiet chambers of monasteries, in the echoing halls of new universities, and in the private conversations between husbands and wives, the question of how a new soul was crafted was a subject of profound and constant speculation. The answers they devised, built upon the foundations of ancient wisdom, reveal a world struggling to understand itself, weaving together philosophy, faith, and nascent science. This was the one-seed versus two-seed debate, a quiet intellectual battle that shaped the very perception of men, women, and the bond that brought them together. The heavyweight champion in this debate, whose ideas held sway for centuries, was the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. His works, lost to much of Western Europe after the fall of Rome, had been carefully preserved and studied in the Islamic world. When they were reintroduced and translated into Latin around the 12th and 13th centuries, they arrived with the force of revelation. For medieval scholars at the great universities of Paris and Oxford, Aristotle wasn't just a philosopher, he was the philosopher, a source of unimpeachable logic on nearly every subject. On the matter of conception, his theory was elegant, hierarchical, and deeply influential. This was the one-seed theory. Imagine a sculptor standing before a block of marble. The sculptor possesses the idea, the design, the active and animating principle, what Aristotle called the form. The marble is passive. It holds the potential, but it cannot shape itself. It is mere matter, waiting to be acted upon. For Aristotle, human conception worked in precisely the same way. The man, through his seed, provided the form, the soul, the blueprint, the very essence of the new human. The woman, in contrast, provided only the matter, the menstrual blood, which he saw as the raw material, the nutritional substance that would be shaped and given life by the man's contribution. In this view, the woman was the field, and the man was the farmer who planted the seed. She was the oven, and he was the baker who placed the dough inside. Her womb was a workshop, but the creative genius, the true artisan of life, was the man. You can almost feel the quiet certainty of this idea settling into the medieval mind. It aligned perfectly with the existing social order. It was logical, it was authoritative, and it provided a neat, tidy explanation. A child's identity, its spirit, its defining characteristics, were all inherited from the father. The mother was a crucial part of the process. Certainly, a field must be fertile, an oven must be hot, but she was a passive incubator, a vessel whose primary role was to nourish and protect the father's creation. Aristotelian fathers of daughters who were the spitting image of their mothers must have had some very creative explaining to do at the village market, perhaps muttering about the quality of the matter having some minor influence on the final product. But this was not the only idea circulating in the medieval world. Another voice, also from antiquity, offered a different perspective. This was Galen, a Greek physician from the Roman Empire, whose medical texts were the bedrock of European medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen, being more of a hands-on physician who dissected animals to understand anatomy, proposed a two-seed theory. Based on his observations, he argued that both the man and the woman produced a seed, or sperma, and that both were necessary for conception. On the surface, this sounds far more modern, more egalitarian. It suggests a partnership, a blending of two essential contributions. This theory had its own fascinating, if slightly peculiar, logic. Galenic physicians believed that women possessed an anatomy that was an inverted, imperfect version of the male's. They believed women had internal testicles, what we now know as ovaries, which produced this female seed. This seed, they theorized, was released during intercourse and mixed with the male seed in the womb. Historians still argue whether the average person on the manor was even aware of these complex debates. or if their understanding of life's creation was rooted in a more primal folk tradition, disconnected from the dense Latin texts of the scholastics. Yet, among the educated, this two-seed model was a serious contender to the Aristotelian worldview. However, we must not mistake this for a theory of equality. Even within Galen's two-seed framework, a strict hierarchy was maintained. The male seed was considered superior in every way. It was described as hot and dry qualities associated with strength, perfection, and activity. The female seed, by contrast, was cold and wet qualities associated with weakness, passivity, and imperfection. The male seed was the potent, primary agent, the one that truly cooked and coagulated the mixture into a fetus. The female seed was seen as a weaker, less perfect version, a kind of secondary ingredient that added substance but lacked the vital heat to create life on its own. It seems even bodily fluids had a strict social ladder to climb in the medieval mind. The man's seed was the master chef, and the woman's was the humble kitchen apprentice, providing the stock for the soup but having no say in the final recipe. So, the medieval intellectual landscape held these two competing, yet strangely similar ideas. In a university lecture hall, you might find a master of theology arguing for Aristotle's one-seed theory, as it aligned beautifully with the idea of a singular, masculine God creating humanity. Down the street, a physician, poring over his translated copy of Galen, might argue for the two-seed theory, insisting that observation pointed to a contribution from both parents. This debate influenced everything. It was used to explain why a child might resemble its mother. Her seed, though weaker, had made its mark. It was even used to speculate on the determination of sex. Some believed that if the hotter male seed from the right testicle combined with female seed in the right side of the womb, a boy was assured. The creation of a girl was seen as a cooler, less perfect, left-sided affair. Ultimately, whether you subscribed to the one-seed or two-seed theory, the conclusion was troublingly the same. The male principle was active and formative, while the female was passive and material, or at the very best, a junior partner. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It had profound, real-world consequences. It provided a biological justification for a social and legal system where women had fewer rights, where their voices were softer, and their authority was limited. It was a constant struggle for women to assert their worth in a world where the very science of their bodies, as understood at the time, defined them as secondary. It was a philosophical system so perfectly constructed to prove the status quo that you almost have to admire the sheer intellectual effort, if not the conclusion. And so, these ancient debates, whispered in cold stone halls and dusty libraries, about seeds and souls, form and matter, echoed through the centuries, shaping the rhythm of their lives in the most intimate way imaginable. Let us drift now into the quiet, inner world of a medieval household, to a time of profound and anxious waiting. The 9 months of pregnancy were a journey not just of the body, but of the mind and spirit, lived within a framework of belief that is almost alien to us now. For a pregnant woman was seen as more than a mother-to-be. She was an impressionable vessel, a canvas upon which the world could leave its indelible mark. Her womb was not a fortress, but a space of delicate, permeable connection to the outside world. The central guiding principle of this time was the belief in maternal impression. This was not mere folklore, but a widely accepted medical theory, with roots stretching back to the classical physicians of Greece and Rome. The idea was simple, yet its implications were vast and terrifying. Whatever a mother saw, felt, or even strongly imagined, could be physically imprinted upon the developing child within her. The fetus was like soft wax, and the mother's experiences were the seal, suppressing a permanent design. A sudden fright, a shocking sight, a lingering craving all held the power to shape the infant's form. Imagine the weight of this belief settling upon a woman from the moment she knew she was with child, her daily life transformed into a careful navigation of potential hazards. A walk through the village market was no longer a simple errand, but a gauntlet of potentially damaging sights. She would be encouraged to avert her eyes from anything considered ugly, deformed, or frightening. A beggar with a missing limb, an animal being butchered, even a person with a prominent birthmark, all were to be avoided, lest the image transfer itself to her own child. A sudden encounter with a leaping hare could, it was believed, result in a child with a cleft lip. A fright from a scurrying mouse might leave a small, furry, mouse-shaped mark upon the baby's skin. Consequently, the ideal environment for a pregnant woman was one of curated beauty and tranquility. She was encouraged to spend her time in pleasant gardens, to gaze upon beautiful art, fine tapestries, or the handsome, well-formed faces of other people's children. Her thoughts were to be as serene as her surroundings. She was to listen to harmonious music and avoid arguments or distressing news. It was a constant, gentle, yet unyielding pressure to exist in a state of placid perfection. This intense focus on the external world was mirrored by a deep curiosity about the internal one, particularly the strange and powerful cravings that could seize a woman. These were not dismissed as simple whims. A sudden, overwhelming desire for a particular food was seen as a direct communication from the fetus, a portent of its character or needs. A longing for red meat or salty, savory foods was thought to indicate a boy, strong and robust. A craving for sweet fruits, honeyed cakes, or dairy pointed to a girl. The most peculiar of these cravings, known as pica, involved a desire for non-food items, chalk, clay, coal, or earth. While we now understand this as a potential sign of mineral deficiency, in the medieval mind, it was a mysterious and often worrying omen. If a woman craved a food and did not get it, it was believed the child might be born with a birthmark shaped like the denied item. You can imagine the frantic effort to procure a specific, out-of-season fruit for a noble woman, not just to satisfy her, but to protect the heir from being born with a permanent, strawberry-shaped blemish on his cheek. It's a bit more pressure than just a late-night run for pickles and ice cream, a combination for which the medieval pantry was likely entirely unprepared. Alongside the anxiety of impression was the gentle hum of speculation about the child's gender. Lacking any definitive way to know, a rich tapestry of folklore and observation grew to fill the void. These methods were applied with great seriousness, though their accuracy was likely no better than a coin toss. A woman carrying high and wide was having a girl, low and forward, a boy. Rosy cheeks and a bright complexion signaled a daughter, while a paler, drawn look meant a son was draining her vitality. Some even looked to the father for clues if he was gaining weight alongside his wife. It was surely a girl. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were more a source of genuine comfort and community bonding, or a framework for social control over women's behavior during pregnancy. Whatever their purpose, they filled the long months of waiting with a language of signs and symbols, allowing the family and community to feel connected to the unseen life. But beneath it all, the primary emotional current was a quiet, persistent anxiety. The doctrine of maternal impression placed an almost impossible burden of responsibility on the mother. A moment of anger, a flash of terror, a sorrowful thought, any of these could be seen as a personal failing if the child was born with any kind of imperfection. Imagine the internal policing of one's own mind, the struggle to remain perpetually calm and positive. A pregnant woman might clutch a religious amulet, whispering prayers for protection not only from external evils, but from her own fleeting, dark thoughts. She was told to avoid looking at monkeys, for instance, lest the baby be born ugly or, heaven forbid, overly mischievous. The pressure was immense. She was the sole guardian of her child's physical perfection, the living vessel whose every ripple could cause a tidal wave in the womb. As the 9 months drew to a close, as her body grew heavy and the first signs of labor neared, this anxiety would reach its peak. The moment of birth was not just a physical trial, it was the moment of revelation, when all the care, all the averted glances, and all the curated thoughts would be judged. It was the moment she would finally know if her vessel had held true. Let us move now from the public square and the structured world of men into a space that was, for all intents and purposes, a world of its own. We enter the birthing chamber, a room sealed not just by a heavy wooden door, but by centuries of tradition and an unwritten, yet unbreakable, law. This was a sacred and guarded domain, a kingdom ruled entirely by women. As the time of delivery, or travail, approached, the expectant mother would retreat into this inner sanctum, leaving the masculine world behind. The windows would be covered, shutting out the harsh light of day and any prying eyes. Every keyhole might be plugged, every draft sealed, creating a warm, dim, and enclosed environment, thick with the scent of beeswax candles, simmering herbs, and human anxiety. Here, the woman was not alone. She was surrounded by her gossips, a term that originally meant god siblings and referred to the close female companions, relatives, and neighbors who would attend the birth. Her own mother would be there, a figure of stoic experience. Her sisters, aunts, and cousins would bustle about, whispering encouragement, fetching water, and managing the household just beyond the chamber door. It was a network of support, a web of shared female experience, and at its very center was the midwife. She was the undisputed authority in this room, a woman whose knowledge was not learned from Latin texts, but inherited through a long line of practice, observation, and intuition. She had seen it all, and her calm presence was the anchor in a sea of uncertainty. And the uncertainty was immense. We must be clear about a fundamental and sobering reality of this age for a young woman. The greatest single threat to her life was the act of bringing life into the world. It is a stark mainstream historical fact that childbirth and its subsequent complications were the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. A grim statistic that would hold true for centuries. A successful delivery was a moment of profound relief and celebration, but the path to it was shadowed by risk, infection. What would later be called puerperal fever was a silent and invisible killer. Hemorrhage could turn triumph to tragedy in a matter of moments. A difficult or obstructed labor could last for days, exhausting the mother and leading to a cascade of fatal problems. Every birth was a gamble, a roll of the dice where the stakes were the highest imaginable. Faced with such peril, these women marshaled every resource at their disposal, creating a fascinating blend of the practical, the spiritual, and the magical. Prayer was constant. The air in the birthing chamber would be filled with a low, continuous murmur of appeals to the Virgin Mary, and especially to St. Margaret of Antioch. The legend of St. Margaret, who was said to have been swallowed by a dragon and then burst forth from its belly unharmed, made her the ultimate patron saint of a safe and successful delivery. Her story was a powerful metaphor for escaping the jaws of a perilous labor. Alongside these prayers were objects of power and protection. Amulets, carved from jet or coral, might be clutched in the laboring woman's hand or sewn into the bedding, intended to ward off evil spirits that were believed to be drawn to the vulnerability of birth. But perhaps the most intriguing and specific of these aids was the birthing girdle. This is a wonderfully quirky tidbit of history. These were not simple belts, but often long, elaborate scrolls of parchment, vellum, or silk. They were meticulously inscribed with prayers, magical formulas, and images of the saints. This girdle would be wrapped snugly around the woman's abdomen, a physical and spiritual shield intended to ease the pain and guide the child safely into the world. Some of these girdles were precious heirlooms, passed down through generations, while others were owned by churches or even royalty, loaned out to women of high status as a special favor. Imagine the comfort, the sense of connection, of wrapping yourself in the same scroll that had helped your mother and her mother before her. All of this activity, this entire system of belief and practice, occurred with one strict rule: no men allowed. Male physicians, for all their university education, were kept firmly outside the door. Their knowledge was based on the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates, which contained very little practical information about the mechanics of childbirth. They were theorists, and the birthing chamber was a place of intense, hands-on practice. Historians still argue whether the exclusion of male physicians was primarily due to social modesty and the preservation of a sacred female space, or if it stemmed from a genuine and well-founded belief that the abstract, bookish knowledge of men was simply inferior to the time-tested practical skills of the midwife. A physician of the era, if consulted at all, might be asked to diagnose the progress of labor by examining a flask of the woman's urine, which he would do from another room entirely. One can only imagine the midwife's quiet smirk at such a detached and, frankly, unhelpful analysis. The midwife, meanwhile, was at the mother's side. She used her hands to assess the baby's position, her voice to soothe and direct, and her knowledge of herbal lore to offer what comfort she could. She might prepare a posset of warm ale and spices to restore strength, or burn lavender to calm the air. Her role was all-encompassing. She was part nurse, part coach, part spiritual guide, and, if the worst happened, part grief counselor in this warm, dark, all-female world. She was the commander, her authority absolute. She orchestrated the delicate, dangerous dance of birth, using every tool she had, from a reassuring touch to a whispered prayer on a parchment scroll, to navigate the narrow passage between life and death, hoping to welcome one new soul into the world without losing another. It was a constant struggle, a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of women in an age that offered them few other spheres of absolute control. And in this one, sacred room, their rule was law. The great ordeal is over. The cries of labor have faded, replaced by the softer, more tentative cry of a newborn. In the quiet dimness of the birthing room, a profound stillness settles. The air, once electric with tension and effort, now hangs heavy and thick, smelling of lingering herbs, sweat, and the uniquely sweet scent of a new baby. For the mother, lying in the semi-darkness of her chamber, this is the beginning of a strange and sacred interlude, a period known as the lying in. For the next 40 days, the world would shrink to the size of this room. This was not a punishment, but a deeply ingrained tradition, a cocoon of recovery and protection for both her and her child. Imagine her there, nestled in the straw-stuffed mattress, the rough linen sheets softened by many washings. The world outside the heavy wooden shutters carries on the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant call of a vendor, the barking of a dog, but for her, these are sounds from another realm. Her realm is one of quiet murmurs, of female companionship. Her mother, her sisters, her neighbors, and the midwife who had seen her through the trial of birth now form a protective circle around her. They are the keepers of this quiet time. They bring her nourishing broths and the traditional postpartum drink, a warm, spiced, and often alcoholic gruel called caudle, designed to restore her strength. They tend the fire, change the baby's swaddling, and speak in low, comforting tones, sharing stories and advice passed down through generations. This was a socially mandated recovery period, a concept we sometimes struggle to replicate today, a formal recognition that the body and soul need time to heal after the monumental act of creation. But this confinement was not merely practical, it was deeply woven with spiritual and ritualistic significance. The practice was rooted in ancient biblical tradition, specifically the Levitical laws of purity. This is a mainstream historical fact you can find in any study of medieval religious practice following the Old Testament. A woman was considered ritually unclean for 40 days after the birth of a son, and 80 days after the birth of a daughter. It's crucial to understand that this uncleanness was not a moral judgment. It was not a sign that she had sinned. Rather, it was a ritual state tied to the profound and mysterious processes of life and death, blood and birth, which were seen as powerful, sacred, and set apart from the everyday. Childbirth touched upon the very foundations of creation and the legacy of Eve, and so it required a period of separation before a woman could be reintegrated into the sacred space of the community's church. At the end of the 40 days, the confinement would culminate in a formal ceremony, a rite of passage known as the churching of women. On that day, the house would stir with a different kind of energy. The mother would rise from her bed of rest and, for the first time in over a month, dress not in a simple bedgown, but in her best kirtle and gown. Imagine her fingers, perhaps a little stiff, fastening the hooks or lacing the bodice. Her hair, once loosely braided, would be carefully pinned and covered with a clean, crisp veil or coif. She was rejoining the world, carrying a small offering and accompanied by her female attendants, her gossips, the same women who attended the baptism. She would walk from her home to the church. Think of the sensations of that first walk, the feel of cool, fresh air on her skin, so different from the close, warm air of her room. The brightness of the sun might make her blink, her eyes having grown accustomed to the dim light of the lying-in chamber. The sounds of the village would no longer be muffled and distant, but immediate and vibrant. She would not, however, stride directly into the church. Her journey paused at the church door. Here, she would wait, a symbolic position on the threshold between her private, ritually separated world and the public, sacred space of the congregation. The priest, having been notified, would come out to meet her. He would be carrying his book of rites, and his voice would be the first official welcome back she would receive. Reciting psalms of thanksgiving, he would then lead her inside. Sometimes he would take her by the hand, a physical gesture of guidance, leading her out of her ritual seclusion. He would sprinkle her with holy water, a classic act of purification, before bringing her to a designated spot, often a special kneeling stool near the altar. There, she would kneel and offer a prayer of thanks for her survival, a prayer that was deeply heartfelt in an age where 1 in 3 women might not survive the experience. She would then make her offering. This was often a small coin, but a particularly poignant and lesser-known tidbit is the offering of the chrism cloth. This was the white linen garment that her baby wore when it was baptized, a symbol of its purity and innocence. If the child had survived, the cloth was given to the church. But if the infant had tragically died between its baptism and its mother's churching, that same white cloth would often be used as its tiny shroud, and the mother's churching ceremony would be a moment of profound public grief as well as personal thanksgiving for her own life. This leads us to a central question, and it is a point on which historians still argue whether the rite of churching was primarily a joyful celebration of survival or a necessary cleansing from the taint of childbirth. On one hand, it was undeniably a celebration. The woman had faced death and emerged victorious. The community formally rejoiced in her safe return and in the new life she had brought into the world. The service was officially called the Thanksgiving of Women After Childbirth, and it was almost always followed by a small feast. This was the moment she could once again share a pint of ale with her neighbors, visit the market, and resume her place in the rhythm of their lives. It was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of finally being cleared to leave the house without a diaper bag the size of a small donkey. On the other hand, the ritual's structure and language were undeniably those of purification. The waiting at the door, the sprinkling of holy water, the very idea that a special ceremony was required to re-enter the church, all of this pointed to a state of being that needed to be ritually corrected. The woman was not a sinner, but she was considered temporarily unfit for the holy space, and the churching was the remedy. For the woman herself, these theological distinctions were likely less important than the experience itself. She would have felt a complex mixture of gratitude, relief, and simple acceptance of a world where faith structured every aspect of life. The enforced rest of the lying in was likely a welcome respite, and the churching ceremony a comforting and beautiful marker that her ordeal was truly over. The feast that followed was probably the first time in 40 days she'd had a drink that wasn't some form of warm, medicinal caudle, which must have been a celebration in itself. It was the beginning of her new normal. A normal that, as any new parent knows, involved a great deal more work and a great deal less seen on sleep than the old one. Now, let us turn our attention from the moment of birth to the very sustenance of new life, a subject surrounded by a fog of intricate beliefs and profound anxieties. For in the medieval and early modern mind, the act of feeding an infant was far more than simple nutrition. It was a transfer of essence, a shaping of the soul itself, and it all began with the mysterious, vital fluid of mother's milk. To understand the gravity of this, you must first understand what they believed milk to be. It was not, in their view, a substance created on its own. Instead, prevailing medical theory, stretching all the way back to the ancient Greek physician, Galen, held that breast milk was simply a refined form of blood. The body, in its wisdom, was thought to divert blood from the womb after childbirth, sending it upwards to the breasts. There, through a process they called concoction, the blood was whitened, purified, and transformed into milk. Imagine their view of the female body as a series of connected vessels and chambers, where fluids moved and changed according to the needs of life, a delicate internal alchemy. If milk was refined blood, and blood was the carrier of the four humors that governed one's health and temperament, then the terrifying and wondrous conclusion was inescapable. Milk could transmit the very character of the feeder to the child. Everything the woman was her physical strengths, her moral failings, her intellectual capacity, her emotional state was thought to be concentrated into this white liquid and passed directly into the infant. A mother's milk could instill courage or cowardice, generosity or greed, a quick wit or a dull mind. This belief system turned breastfeeding into an act freighted with immense responsibility. It also created a significant dilemma for the upper classes. For a host of reasons, from social status to the desire to conceive again quickly to preserve the family line, wealthy women often outsourced this crucial task. And so, the selection of a wet nurse became one of the most important decisions a family could make, a matter of grave consequence for the future disposition of their heir. This was not a casual hiring process. It was a rigorous, almost clinical vetting that scrutinized every imaginable aspect of the candidate. The ideal wet nurse was a figure of pastoral perfection, often sought from the countryside, where the air was cleaner and life was believed to be simpler and more virtuous. A physician, or perhaps the family patriarch, would conduct the examination. First, there was the physical inspection. The woman had to be of a sturdy build, not too thin and not too plump. She needed a clear complexion, good teeth, and steady eyes. They believed her own child was a living testament to the quality of her milk. So it was a great advantage if she had recently given birth to a healthy, robust boy. Then came the inspection of the milk itself. The 2nd century physician Cyranus of Ephesus laid out guidelines that were still being referenced over 1,000 years later. A drop of the nurse's milk might be placed on a fingernail. If it held its globular shape without running, it was considered to be of good consistency. It had to be tasted for sweetness, not too salty, not too bitter. It needed to be perfectly white, with no reddish or yellowish tinge that might suggest it was not properly concocted from her blood. It was a role that combined the duties of a caregiver with the palate of a particularly discerning dairy critic. But the physical was only half of the equation. Her moral and emotional character were under an even finer microscope. Investigators might be dispatched to her village to inquire about her reputation. Was she chaste, pious, even-tempered? She could not be prone to anger, for fear the child would develop a choleric and aggressive personality. She could not be melancholic, lest the infant grow into a sad and listless adult. She certainly could not be too fond of wine or frivolous company, as these vices were thought to pass directly through the milk, tainting the child's character from the cradle. They were looking for a woman who was, in essence, a placid, cheerful, and slightly bovine vessel of virtue. Historians still argue whether these elaborate selection rituals were driven more by genuine medical belief or by deep-seated social anxieties about a lower-class woman physically and spiritually shaping an aristocratic heir. Once selected, the wet nurse's life became completely regimented. She would move into the family's home, living under their constant supervision. Her diet was strictly controlled. She was fed simple, nourishing foods thought to produce the best milk broths, breads, and mild meats. She was forbidden from eating anything too spicy, too salty on tartare, or too sour. Even foods like beans or cabbage were often off limits, with the surprisingly modern reasoning that they might give the baby gas. It seems some parental wisdom is truly timeless. Her emotional life was managed as well. She was to be kept calm and content, shielded from any upsetting news or stressful situations. Her entire being was now dedicated to one purpose: producing a steady supply of perfect, character-building milk for another woman's child. Of course, there is a quiet tragedy at the heart of this widespread historical practice. For the wet nurse to be available, she often had to give up her own infant, either sending the baby back to her village to be raised by relatives, or, in a sadder turn, feeding it less nourishing animal milk or pap. The very system that promised the best start in life for a wealthy child often necessitated a compromised start for a poorer one. It was a constant struggle, a stark example of the inequalities that were woven into the very fabric of daily life. The mainstream historical fact is that this system was not a niche curiosity. From ancient Rome through the 19th century, wet nursing was the standard for the European nobility and the growing merchant classes. A child suckled by its own aristocratic mother was the exception, not the rule. The entire architecture of the noble household, the rhythm of their lives, was built around this fundamental delegation of maternal duty, all based on the profound belief that in a few drops of milk lay the blueprint for a person's entire future. From the fundamental belief that the female body was a landscape of coldness and dampness, a related and even more influential idea began to seep into the medical and philosophical consciousness of the pre-modern world. If the male body, with its internal heat, was a well-tended furnace efficiently burning its fuel, then the female body was more akin to a cool, earthen vessel. And what happens to an earthen vessel filled with too much liquid? It becomes saturated, its very substance permeated by moisture. It becomes porous. It begins to leak. This concept of the inherently leaky female body was not meant as a mere insult, but as a literal physiological explanation for a vast array of female experiences and perceived characteristics. It was a theory that explained everything, a key that seemed to unlock the mysteries of half the population. The most obvious and undeniable evidence for this theory was, of course, menstruation. In the humoral framework, this monthly bleeding was not seen as part of a procreative cycle as we understand it today. Instead, it was viewed as a necessary, if imperfect, safety valve, because the female body lacked the requisite heat to cook or concoct its humors into more refined substances like robust blood or semen. It was left with a surplus of crude, cold, wet fluid. This excess had to go somewhere. The body, unable to contain it, simply expelled it. Menstruation was therefore a sign of this constitutional weakness, a monthly reminder that the female form was fundamentally unable to manage its own internal economy. It was a leak, the most prominent of many that defined female existence. But this theory of porosity extended far beyond this single biological function. It created a paradigm through which almost every aspect of a woman's being was interpreted. Consider weeping. When a woman cried, it was seen as another manifestation of this same humoral surplus. Her tears were not just an expression of sadness or joy, but a literal overflow of the excessive moisture within her. She was not necessarily more emotional in a psychological sense. She was simply wetter in a physical one, and this wetness had to find an outlet. The body, being porous, would release this excess fluid through the eyes. A man might feel deep sorrow, but his inner heat would, in theory, help him contain and process it. A woman's sorrow, however, would simply spill over. This model even extended to speech. A woman perceived as overly talkative or prone to sharing secrets was, in a very real sense, to the medieval or Renaissance mind, leaking words. Her body's inability to contain its physical fluids was mirrored by an inability to contain her thoughts and spoken expressions. The boundaries of her mouth were just as permeable as the other boundaries of her body. Historians still argue whether these medical theories were genuine attempts to understand biology or simply convenient justifications for existing social hierarchies. It is, after all, quite telling that a loquacious man was often seen as a brilliant orator or a charming conversationalist, while his female counterpart was diagnosed with a physiological condition. You could say he was seen as a fountain of wisdom, while she was just springing a leak. This perceived porosity had profound and often dangerous implications. For a body that could leak outward could just as easily be infiltrated from the outside. The boundaries were weak in both directions. A woman was considered more physically vulnerable to her environment. Imagine her walking through a marshy field on a misty morning. The damp, heavy air, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, was thought to carry disease, the infamous miasma. A man's hot, dry body might repel this unhealthy air, his internal furnace keeping the dampness at bay. But a woman's body, being already cold, wet, and porous, would act like a sponge. It would simply absorb the malevolent vapors, drawing illness into its very core. Her skin was not a shield, but a sieve. This belief made women seem constitutionally more fragile, constantly at risk from the world around them. The most terrifying implication of this porosity, however, was not physical but spiritual. If bad air and disease could so easily permeate a woman's physical form, then what of immaterial forces? What of spirits, demons, and temptations? The porous body was thought to be analogous to a porous soul. Her spiritual defenses were believed to be just as weak as her physical ones. In a world where the air itself was thought to be alive with unseen entities, a woman was seen as uniquely vulnerable. She was an unlocked house in a dangerous neighborhood, a passing demon, a tempting spirit. or the devil himself could find easier purchase, slipping through the weak spiritual boundaries that corresponded to her physical form. This belief had devastating real-world consequences, providing a theoretical framework for misogyny and, in its most extreme form, persecution. It is a well-documented mainstream historical fact that women were disproportionately accused during the great European witch hunts. The infamous 15th century text, the Malleus Maleficarum Mulieribus, or Hammer of Witches, explicitly states that women are more susceptible to demonic temptations due to being feebler in both mind and body. This wasn't just baseless prejudice. It was prejudice built upon centuries of so-called medical and philosophical reasoning about the porous, leaky female body. An older postmenopausal woman was considered especially dangerous, as her monthly leak had ceased, meaning all those corrupt humors were now supposedly building up inside her, turning putrid and making her a perfect vessel for demonic collaboration. On a less dramatic but more pervasive level, this belief affected daily life in countless ways. A quirky but once common tidbit of folklore held that a menstruating woman's very presence could have a corrupting influence on the world around her. It was believed she could cause wine to spoil, milk to curdle, bread dough to refuse to rise, and even bright metal to rust. Her leakage was thought to taint her very being, making her a source of decay. It gave a whole new meaning to the phrase, if looks could kill in this case. It was more like, if your presence could wilt the lettuce. The world saw her not as a whole and self-contained person, but as a being whose internal nature was constantly and uncontrollably seeping out, potentially affecting everything she touched. This constant struggle to maintain her physical and spiritual integrity was a defining, though often unspoken, feature of a woman's life, a quiet battle fought against the very nature of her own body, as it was then understood. Let us drift now, away from the world of steel and statecraft, and into a quieter, more intimate space, the realm of personal appearance, where the grand narratives of history are reflected in the subtlest of choices. In the high medieval court, the ideal of feminine beauty was as carefully constructed as a cathedral's rose window, and just as far removed from the earth below. The woman celebrated in art and courtly poetry was an almost ethereal creature. Imagine her as she appears in the illuminated manuscripts of the age, slender, almost willowy, with a long, graceful neck and narrow shoulders. Her skin is a luminous, almost translucent pale, a testament to a life lived indoors, shielded from the sun's revealing gaze. This pallor was not merely a sign of beauty, but a clear and potent symbol of class. It declared a life free from the necessity of outdoor labor, a life of leisure and refinement. Her expression is invariably demure, her eyes downcast, a picture of modesty and serene piety. But of all the features that defined this idealized form, none was more prized than the high, domed forehead. To the modern eye, it can look unusual, almost alien. Yet in the late Middle Ages, a vast, smooth expanse of forehead was considered the pinnacle of beauty and a clear signifier of intelligence and nobility. It gave the face an open, placid, and almost philosophical quality. This is the face you see in the portraits of Agnès Sorel, the famous mistress of King Charles VII of France, or in the serene Madonnas painted by artists like Jean Fouquet. Her forehead seems to go on forever, a smooth, pale canvas upon which her noble character is written. This was not a natural look for most, but rather a fashion to be diligently pursued. And so, for the elite woman, achieving this fashionable look was a private, patient ritual. In her chambers, with perhaps a lady-in-waiting to assist, she would undertake the painstaking process of epilation. Imagine her seated before a polished silver mirror, the light from a nearby window catching the fine hairs along her natural hairline. With a small pair of bronze or iron tweezers, she would begin to pluck them out, one by one. The goal was to raise the hairline significantly, sometimes by an inch or more, creating that coveted, high-domed appearance. It was a slow, meticulous task, requiring a steady hand and a high tolerance for minor discomfort. This practice extended to the eyebrows as well. They were often plucked into thin, high, elegant arches, or sometimes removed entirely to further enhance the vastness of the forehead. The look was stark, clean, and deliberate. You can almost picture the quiet focus, the soft twinge of each hair being removed, followed by the application of a soothing balm, perhaps made with rosewater or chamomile, to calm the reddened skin. It's a quiet reminder that the pursuit of a specific beauty standard, no matter the era, often involves a fair bit of uncomfortable maintenance. I suppose it's one of history's little ironies that one might spend hours in discomfort, all to achieve a look of serene, untroubled grace. A quirky and somewhat alarming tidbit from this era is the existence of depilatory creams for those who wish to avoid the tedium of plucking. Recipes survive for pastes made from ingredients like arsenic sulfide or quicklime mixed with water or vinegar. A woman would apply this caustic concoction to her hairline, wait for it to work its dubious magic, and then scrape it and the hair away. While likely effective, it was a risky endeavor, a gamble with chemical burns for the sake of a fashionable forehead. It seems beauty has always flirted with danger. Now, let this image of the pale, plucked, and poised noblewoman dissolve, and let us replace it with another, more common reality. Picture instead a peasant woman, working in the fields of a country estate, or a merchant's wife, bustling through a crowded city market. Her body tells a different story. It is not slender and willowy, but strong and capable, with muscles hardened by the rhythms of her life by lifting water, grinding grain, or carrying goods. Her hands are not the soft, pale things of courtly romance. They are calloused and competent, tools of labor and survival. Her skin, far from being a luminous white, is weathered by the elements. It carries the color of the sun and the wind, a healthy, earthy tan that would have been seen as coarse and common by the elite. Her forehead is simply a forehead, framed by her natural hairline. Her hair likely tied back for practicality, not styled for fashion. She had neither the time nor the resources for painstaking epilation. Her beauty was one of function, strength, and resilience, a beauty written not by poets, but by the daily realities of her existence. Historians still argue whether the high forehead fashion was purely an aesthetic preference, or if it was also a conscious and perhaps even cruel signal of a woman's leisurely status, a way to make the chasm between the lady in the castle and the woman in the field visibly, undeniably clear. The contrast is stark. One woman's body is a canvas for artifice and aristocratic ideals, a symbol of wealth and leisure so profound that she can afford to reshape the very frame of her face. The other's body is a testament to labor, a practical vessel shaped by the demands of the world. It's a poignant illustration of how beauty standards are never universal. They are born of a specific time and place, and often serve to reinforce the social structures that govern people's lives. It was an era where you could tell a woman's social standing just by the distance between her eyebrows and her hair. And if you think about it, spending an afternoon plucking your hairline just to look more intelligent might be the most medieval humble brag of all. The two women, the pale lady and the sun-browned worker, might have lived only miles apart, but in the world of beauty, they inhabited entirely different planets, one defined by the pursuit of an ethereal ideal, the other by the unadorned truth of a life of labor. The legal and social frameworks we have been exploring did not exist in a vacuum. They were buttressed by a deep and pervasive cultural anxiety, one that could be traced back to the very first stories told around the hearths of Europe. It was an anxiety centered on something seemingly simple, yet believed to hold the power to unravel civilization itself, the sound of a woman's voice. We move now from the written law to the unwritten, but powerfully felt, rules governing female speech and the perception of that speech as a source of temptation, disorder, and even divine punishment. Imagine, if you will, the quiet rustle of leaves in an ancient, mythical garden. The air is warm, thick with the scent of blossoms and damp earth. In this foundational story, the one that echoed from every pulpit and was etched into the mind of every child, it was not a sword or a fist that brought about the fall of man. It was a voice, a calm, persuasive, feminine voice. Eve's transgression was not just in the act of eating the fruit, but in the act of speaking, of convincing Adam to join her. Her voice, in this telling, became the original instrument of temptation. This narrative created a powerful and enduring legacy. If the first woman's words could lead humanity out of paradise, then the words of every woman thereafter carried a spark of that same dangerous potential. Her voice was the original sin's accomplice. This deep-seated suspicion colored every interaction. A woman's speech was rarely taken at face value. It was filtered through a lens of potential seduction or inherent foolishness. A soft, alluring tone was not a sign of gentle character, but a potential siren's call, designed to lead a man astray from his duties to God and society. Think of a merchant in his shop, listening to a woman haggle over the price of cloth. He might hear not a skilled negotiator, but a temptress using honeyed words to cloud his judgment and cheat him of his profit. The very sound of her voice could be a weapon, a subtle magic that bypassed reason and went straight for a man's weaknesses. Conversely, if her speech was not seen as seductive, it was often dismissed as trivial. The lively chatter of women at the market, the sharing of news and stories while washing clothes at the riverbank, this was not considered conversation. It was gossip, prattling, or the meaningless noise of cackling hens. Men, of course, exchanged information constantly in taverns and guild halls, but they had the good sense to call it discussing business or debating politics. It's a rather convenient distinction, isn't it? This dismissal served a crucial purpose. It reinforced the idea that women's minds were not suited for serious matters. Their thoughts, and the words that expressed them, were deemed lightweight, concerned only with domestic trifles and social nonsense, and therefore unworthy of being heard in any important forum. This perception provided the perfect theological justification for female silence. The letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, a mainstream historical fact known to every churchgoer, were often cited as divine law on the matter. Passages like the one in 1 Timothy, stating, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet," were not just abstract doctrine. They were practical instructions that shaped the very soundscape of public life. In the cool, echoing stone chambers of a cathedral, the air would be filled with the resonant Latin of male priests, the rising and falling chants of a male choir, and the responsive murmurs of the men in the congregation. From the women, there was an expectation of pious, prayerful silence. Their voices were to be contained, kept for the home, for the nursery, for private prayer whispered so softly it couldn't possibly tempt an angel, let alone a man. To speak out in church was an act of profound rebellion, a usurpation of the natural, God-given order. But the fear of the female voice went beyond religion and seeped into the realm of science, or what passed for it at the time. This is where we find a truly quirky and lesser-known tidbit of medieval and early modern thought. Physicians, relying on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, developed medical explanations for a disagreeable female voice. A woman who was argumentative, loud, or, in their words, shrill, was not simply expressing an opinion. She was medically unwell. Her sharp tone was a clear symptom of a humoral imbalance. It was said to be caused by an excess of yellow bile, the humor associated with anger and choleric tempers. A man who shouted was passionate. A woman who shouted was diseased. It was a wonderfully convenient way to win an argument. Simply diagnose your opponent with a faulty liver. Even more bizarre was the connection made to hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for almost any ailment a woman might suffer. The term itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. It was believed that the womb was a free-roaming organ within a woman's body, and if it became light and dry, it might wander from its proper place, causing all manner of chaos, including a disordered voice. A shrill cry or an outburst of speech could be interpreted as the sound of a woman whose very organs were in revolt. The cure might involve fumigating her from below with sweet-smelling herbs to try and lure the wandering womb back to its rightful home. It sounds more like trying to coax a lost cat out from under the porch than a serious medical procedure. The constant struggle for a woman was to modulate her voice to fit a nearly impossible ideal: audible, but not loud; gentle, but not seductive; intelligent, but not argumentative. It was a tightrope walk performed every day. Historians still argue whether these official prohibitions on public speech and the pseudoscientific diagnoses resulted in true silence in the domestic sphere. Evidence from letters and diaries suggests that behind closed doors, women's voices were very much alive. They managed households, educated children, shared wisdom, and wielded considerable influence through their words. Yet, the moment they stepped into the public square, the market, or the church, the weight of Eve's legacy descended, and their most natural form of expression was deemed a potential threat to the fabric of reality itself. Their power had to be contained, pathologized, and, above all, silenced. Damas, let us turn our thoughts now to the inevitable passage of time, to the final season in the life of a medieval woman. Just as the year cycles from the fertile green of summer to the quiet withdrawal of winter, so too was the human body believed to follow its own seasons. For a woman, this transition from her childbearing years to old age was not seen as a gentle fading, but as a dangerous and profound internal transformation, one that could render her body a vessel of unseen poisons. This is the story of the venomous body of the aging crone, a concept rooted not in malice, but in the peculiar logic of medieval medicine. To understand this sphere, you must first remember the central role of humoral theory. As we've explored, the body was a delicate ecosystem of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a mainstream historical fact of the era. Repeated in countless medical texts, was the belief that women were fundamentally colder and wetter beings than men. Their constitutions were thought to produce an excess of fluids, a dampness that required constant management. For a woman in her prime, this management came in a predictable monthly rhythm. Menstruation, known by more poetic names like the flowers, was not understood as part of a reproductive cycle. Instead, it was seen as a crucial act of purgation. It was the body's natural safety valve, a monthly release of the superfluous, potentially corrupting humors that would otherwise accumulate and cause illness. It was a cleansing, a necessary draining that kept the internal landscape in balance. Now, imagine yourself a medieval physician, or even just an ordinary villager, contemplating the body of a woman who has passed this phase of life. Her monthly purgation has ceased. The safety valve, from this perspective, has been sealed shut. The body padalti, which for decades had been producing this excess fluid, continues its work. But now, there is no escape. The humors begin to build. the internal rivers, once flowing, become a stagnant lake. And as anyone living in a world without modern sanitation knew, stagnant water breeds corruption. It putrefies. It turns foul. This is the very heart of the belief. The postmenopausal woman's body was thought to become a closed container where these retained fluids would slowly spoil. Over months and years, this accumulation of unreleased humors would transform, in their view, into a substance they literally described as venom. This wasn't always a metaphor. It was a perceived physiological reality. This venom, a concentration of all the body's waste and excess, was believed to saturate her entire being. Think of the air in a room that has been sealed for a generation, thick with the scent of dust and slow decay. That was the imagined internal state of the older woman, a body slowly turning inward, pickling in its own toxic essence. This internal venom was then believed to manifest in terrifying external ways, laying the biological groundwork for the archetype of the evil crone. Her very physicality could become a weapon. It was thought that this poison could be expelled through her breath, making it noxious enough to sicken a child. Her touch could be blighting, causing plants to wither or food to spoil, and most famously, her gaze could become a vector for this poison. The concept of the evil eye was not merely a magical curse, it was a medical theory. A simple, lingering look from an old woman was believed to be a projection of her internal venom, powerful enough to curdle milk in the churn, strike a pig with sickness, or cause a healthy man to stumble. Her presence itself became a source of ambient dread. A lesser-known tidbit from certain medieval texts suggests a fear that this venom could even be transmitted by sharing a cup or sitting too close to her by the fire, as if her toxicity could contaminate the very air around her. This physical transformation was mirrored by a psychological one. The humors, after all, governed not just health, but temperament. As the venom saturated her system, it was believed to sour her personality. The buildup of black bile, the humor of melancholy, would make her perpetually sad and envious of the youth and fertility of others. The corruption of yellow bile, the humor of choler, would make her bitter, spiteful, and prone to fits of rage. Her sharp tongue and resentful mutterings were not seen as the understandable result of a difficult life in a patriarchal society, but as direct symptoms of the poison festering within her. Every complaint, every disagreement, could be dismissed as the venom talking. It's a rather convenient diagnosis, really. It's like blaming your phone's slow performance on it having become morally corrupt, instead of just acknowledging its processor is a few years old. This medical framework created a powerful and dangerous social script. Historians still argue whether this venom theory was a genuine, widespread medical belief held by learned physicians, or if it was primarily a folk superstition that simply used medical language to justify pre-existing social anxieties. Regardless of its origin, the outcome was the same. It provided a seemingly rational, scientific reason to fear and ostracize older women, particularly those who lived alone, were widowed, or possessed traditional knowledge of herbs and healing. She was no longer just an eccentric elder. She was a walking biohazard. This belief system transformed the figure of the grandmother, the keeper of stories and traditions, into a potential monster. Every misfortune in a village, a stillborn calf, a blighted crop, a sudden fever could be traced back to the venomous gaze or breath of the local crone. It's a truly sobering thought that a lifetime of experience could be medically reframed as a lifetime of accumulating poison. Modern society, of course, understands menopause as a natural hormonal transition, a new chapter, not a toxic conclusion, though some might joke that a hot flash can certainly make one feel a bit venomous. At least there's no longer a risk of being blamed for souring the village's beer. The medieval crone, however, had no such luxury. She was trapped not just by her aging body, but by a terrifying theory that pathologized her very existence, turning the wisdom of age into the venom of resentment, a slow internal corruption that made her a threat to all. Now, let us turn our attention to a corner of medical history that is at once deeply personal and profoundly strange. We move into the realm of uniquely female ailments, where the lines between medicine, magic, and misunderstanding blurred into a confusing and often distressing landscape. The foundation of much of this thought rested on a concept inherited from the ancient Greeks, a theory so influential it colored gynecological care for nearly 2 millennia. The idea of the wandering womb. In this view, the uterus was not a fixed organ, but a semi-autonomous creature within the female body. It was thought to be flighty, sensitive, and prone to traveling if displeased, causing a cascade of symptoms ranging from shortness of breath and fainting to melancholy and what was famously termed hysteria. Or the challenge for the medieval or Renaissance physician, then, was not just treating an illness, but coaxing, luring, or sometimes frightening a wayward organ back to its rightful home. Imagine a woman suffering from a uterine prolapse, a condition where the uterus descends from its normal position. To the modern mind, this is a clear mechanical and muscular issue, but to the physician of the past, it was a prime example of the womb moving downwards, perhaps attracted by something or fleeing something else. The treatment, therefore, had to be equally dramatic. One of the most startling remedies was a process of fumigation. The woman would be positioned, sometimes on a special chair with a hole in the seat, or in more extreme cases, suspended partially upside down. Below her, a brazier would be lit, not with sweet-smelling incense, but with substances chosen for their foul and acrid odor. The smoke from burning resin, sulfur, or even dried dung would rise, thick and unpleasant. The logic was simple. If deeply flawed, the womb, like any sensitive creature, would be repulsed by the horrific smell and would retreat upwards, back into its proper place. The air would grow heavy and stinging, filled with a scent that clung to fabric and hair. For the woman undergoing this, it was an ordeal of profound discomfort, suspended in a cloud of smoke, hoping this strange, aggressive persuasion would bring her body back into balance. When the womb was not wandering, but simply refusing to perform its most vaunted function, conception, a different arsenal of remedies was deployed. The struggle with infertility was a source of immense personal and societal pressure, and the proposed cures reflect a desperate grasp for any possible solution. Here, the practical knowledge of herbalism mixed freely with sympathetic magic. Potions were a mainstay, brewed from a dizzying variety of ingredients. Some, like mugwort or chaste treeberry, may have had genuine, though little understood, hormonal effects. They were part of a long tradition of folk knowledge, passed down through generations of women. But these were often combined with ingredients chosen for purely symbolic reasons. Mandrake root, prized for its vaguely human shape, was thought to be a powerful fertility aid. The logic was that if the root looked like a small person, it must surely help in the creation of one. Beyond potions, the principle of sympathetic magic extended to things sworn on the body. Amulets and talismans were prescribed with the same seriousness as any herbal tonic. A woman might be instructed to wear a pouch containing the dried and powdered parts of a particularly fertile animal. The womb of a hare, for example, was considered a potent charm. This practice highlights a lesser-known tidbit of historical belief, the unique association of the weasel with childbirth. Due to a misunderstanding of its reproductive habits, it was believed that the weasel gave birth through its mouth, and so carrying a part of a weasel, often a dried foot, was thought to ensure an easy delivery. One can only imagine the quiet weight of such an object, a constant, physical reminder of hope and expectation. It's a testament to the human need for agency, the desire to do something, even if that something involved accessorizing with parts of a famously elusive carnivore. For other gynecological complaints, from painful menstruation to amenorrhea, the cures were often rooted in the era's dominant medical framework. The mainstream historical fact that governed nearly all medicine was the humoral theory of Hippocrates and Galen, which posited that health depended on the perfect balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess or deficiency of any one of these could cause illness. Therefore, a woman experiencing menstrual difficulties might be diagnosed with an excess of cold or wet humors. The treatment would be to restore balance. This could involve prescribing a diet of hot and dry foods, like roasted meats and spiced wine. It could also involve bloodletting, not from the arm as was common for other ailments, but from the ankle or foot, with the belief that this would draw the stagnant blood downwards and encourage a proper flow. The physician's role was part diagnostician, part herbalist, and part spiritual counselor. They might mutter an incantation while preparing a plaster, or consult an astrological chart to determine the most auspicious time to administer a remedy. This entire field of medicine is a fascinating, if unsettling, tapestry. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these bizarre cures was a result of a genuine lack of anatomical knowledge, or if it was subtly reinforced by a worldview that saw the female body as inherently mysterious and unruly. The treatments themselves reveal a desperate logic using foul smells to repel, human-shaped roots to encourage life, and dietary changes to rebalance a system they could not see. It was a constant struggle to impose order on the complex and often painful realities of the female experience, using a map of the body that was, to our eyes, almost entirely imaginary. The patient, in turn, placed her trust in this blend of science and superstition, breathing in the scented smoke and swallowing the bitter potion, holding onto the hope that this time the wandering womb would finally listen. And so, as we draw the threads of our journey together, we arrive at a final, overarching concept, a belief that shaped the very core of a medieval woman's spiritual and physical identity. It is the idea of the body itself, not as a home, but as a temporary, and often troubled, lodging for the soul. The philosophies we have explored, from the medical to the theological, all converged on this one. Unsettling point, the female body was seen as a problematic, disorderly, and ultimately unfitting vessel. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of this understanding. From the moment of birth, a woman's physical form was framed by the humoral theory as inherently wet, cold, and passive, a constitution prone to imbalance and emotional excess. Ancient Greek thought, filtered through centuries of commentary, reinforced this, however, with Aristotle's influential idea of the female as a misbegotten male, an incomplete version of humanity's blueprint. These were not just abstract theories discussed in dusty libraries. They were the foundational beliefs that informed doctors, priests, husbands, and women themselves. Her very flesh and blood were considered less stable. Her body, a less reliable container for the precious, eternal soul housed within. It was a constant struggle, a pervasive sense that one's own physical self was an untrustworthy companion on the journey through life. This framed the female body as a spiritual battleground. The soul, pure and genderless in its essence, was seen as being trapped in a form that was inherently more susceptible to the temptations of the material world. The body's cycles were mysterious and messy. Its desires were a potential gateway to sin, and its very nature was seen as pulling the soul downward, away from the divine. It was a ship in a perpetually stormy sea, a reality that cast a long shadow over a woman's daily existence. The challenge was not simply to live a pious life, but to do so while constantly fighting against the perceived failings of the very body she inhabited. Into this deeply conflicted landscape stepped the ultimate paradox, the Virgin Mary. Here was a figure who defied every rule. She was a woman, yet her body was the most sacred and perfect vessel. Imaginable, the Theotokos, the God-bearer. The mainstream historical fact is that this title was made official church doctrine at the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE, a decision that cemented her status as the Queen of Heaven and the ultimate female ideal. In countless paintings and statues, she is depicted serene and untouched by the world's corruption, her body a holy tabernacle. She was the grand exception, a woman whose physical form was not a hindrance to her soul, but its perfect partner. For ordinary women, she was both a source of immense comfort and an impossible standard. She demonstrated that a female could achieve holiness, yet her unique, miraculous purity placed her on a pedestal far beyond their reach. It's an unattainable standard that makes today's Instagram influencers look positively reasonable. This contrast created a profound tension. A woman might pray to Mary for protection in childbirth, yet be told by a priest that the pains of labor were Eve's punishment. She would see Mary's placid image in church, then return home to the biological realities of menstruation, illness, and the sheer physicality of medieval life. It was a constant reminder of the gap between the heavenly ideal and the earthly real. The goal was to emulate Mary's virtues, her humility, her piety, her quiet obedience, and the hope that this spiritual discipline could somehow tame and transcend the disorderly vessel that was her body. But theology offered one final, fascinating, and deeply strange solution to this problem. For many influential church fathers, including Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, the final resurrection at the end of time would involve a perfecting of the human body. And historians still argue whether as this was a universal belief. But a dominant theological train of thought concluded that this perfection meant all souls would be resurrected into the ideal human form, the male body. This wasn't necessarily seen as an erasure of the female, but as a completion, an upgrade to the divine template from which woman was thought to have deviated. The idea was that in heaven, physical imperfections and the troublesome dualities of gender would be resolved, with everyone restored to the original, intended state of humanity. This led to some truly unique theological debates, which serve as our quirky tidbit for this section. Theologians, with what seems like a lot of time on their hands, seriously discussed the specifics of these perfected geniture, resurrected bodies. Would they bear the marks of their earthly life? The consensus was that only the scars of martyrs would remain as badges of honor. But what of the female-to-male transformation? Would a resurrected woman resemble her husband, or Adam, or Christ? Would she retain any of her former features? The sheer amount of intellectual energy spent on the logistics of this heavenly transformation highlights just how deeply ingrained the idea of the female body as a temporary, imperfect state truly was. Even in the glorious afterlife, it was something to be fixed, not celebrated in its own right. It was the ultimate statement the soul was eternal, but its earthly female home was a lease that would, thankfully for them, expire. Zar ook enkti. And now, as these complex, heavy thoughts of the past begin to settle, let them also begin to fade. Allow the echoes of these ancient beliefs to soften, to recede into the quiet corners of your mind. Imagine them as old stories, written in a book that you can now gently close. The anxieties and judgments of a world long past have no claim on you. Here in the calm and safety of your own space, feel the simple, solid reality of the surface beneath you, the steady, gentle weight of your blanket, the soft, rhythmic whisper of your own breath. This is the profound comfort of the present moment. Unlike the women of centuries ago, whose bodies were seen as a source of conflict and spiritual unease, you can simply rest in yours. You can feel the rise and fall of your chest without judgment, without theological weight. It is simply you, breathing in and out. Let go of the need to analyze or understand. The journey of our story is complete for tonight, and all that is left is the gentle, downward drift into sleep. There is no struggle here, no battle to be won. There is only the quiet invitation to let go. Feel your awareness shrinking from the wider world, from the distant past, drawing inward to this peaceful point of stillness. The soft hum of the room, the gentle darkness behind your eyelids, the simple, profound peace of being at rest. Let your thoughts become like clouds, drifting slowly by, becoming more distant, more diffuse, until they dissolve completely into the quiet sky of your mind. There is nothing more to do, nowhere else to be, just this moment, just this peace. Allow yourself to drift, to float, to sleep.